The avoidant person moves through relationships with carefully constructed defenses designed to protect them from vulnerability while maintaining the illusion of connection. These defenses work reliably as long as their partners respond predictably, pursuing when the avoidant withdraws, accepting blame for the avoidant's discomfort, tolerating breadcrumbs while hoping for more, expressing hurt that can be dismissed as neediness. The entire defensive structure depends on partners playing their assigned role in the dynamic, reacting emotionally in ways that allow the avoidant person to remain comfortable in their patterns. But there are specific statements that shatter this structure completely. Words that cut through the avoidant person's defenses and force confrontation with truths they've organized their entire relational life around avoiding. These statements don't attack or blame. They don't pursue or demand. They simply name reality with a clarity that the avoidant person cannot deflect or rationalize away. When these words are spoken with genuine calm and conviction, they trigger panic in the avoidant person because they expose the mechanics of patterns that only function when hidden, because they demonstrate that the other person has seen through the defenses and chosen to step out of the dynamic entirely. The avoidant person desperately hopes these statements are never spoken because once they are, the relationship cannot continue in its familiar form. Either genuine change must occur or the relationship must end. And both options require the avoidant person to confront vulnerability they've spent their life avoiding. Understanding these statements reveals not just what threatens the avoidant person's defenses, but what authentic boundary setting and self-respect look like when dealing with someone whose patterns depend on your willingness to chase, accept less than you deserve, and remain confused about what's actually happening. I see what you're doing, and I'm not going to chase you. This statement is the avoidant person's worst nightmare because it accomplishes two things simultaneously. It demonstrates that their patterns are visible and understood, and it removes the pursuit that allows those patterns to function. The avoidant person's defensive strategy depends on their withdrawal, triggering anxiety, and pursuit in their partner. When they create distance, they expect the other person to close that distance through increased effort, expressions of concern, and attempts to restore connection. This pursuit serves a crucial function in the avoidant person's psychology. It confirms they matter, proves they have impact, and maintains their position of power and control. More importantly, the pursuit allows them to blame their withdrawal on the other person's behavior rather than examining their own fear of intimacy. When someone says they see what the avoidant person is doing, it strips away the plausible deniability the avoidant person relies on. They can no longer pretend their withdrawal is about being busy, needing space for legitimate reasons, or responding to something the other person did wrong. The statement names the pattern explicitly. You're creating distance as a defensive strategy, and I recognize it as such. This recognition is deeply threatening because the avoidant person's patterns only work when they remain unconscious and unnamed. Once the pattern is identified clearly, the avoidant person cannot continue enacting it while maintaining the self-image of someone who simply has healthy boundaries and values independence. The second part of the statement, the refusal to chase, removes the very mechanism the avoidant person depends on. Their entire relational strategy is built on the expectation that others will pursue them when they withdraw. This pursuit allows them to maintain connection without vulnerability, to feel wanted without having to demonstrate their own want, to keep people invested while remaining defended themselves. When someone refuses to chase, the avoidant person loses all these benefits. They're confronted with actual distance rather than the controlled distance they usually create, where they withdraw but remain confident the other person will follow. The avoidant person's immediate response to this statement is typically panic masked as indifference or irritation. They might say they don't know what the other person is talking about, that they're not doing anything that requires chasing, that the accusation is unfair or inaccurate. This defensive response is an attempt to restore the dynamic to its familiar form where their patterns remain unnamed and the other person doubts their own perceptions. The avoidant person needs the other person to question whether they're reading the situation correctly, to worry they're being unfair or too sensitive, to retreat from the clarity this statement represents. But if the person maintains their position, calmly standing by the statement without getting drawn into defending or explaining it, the avoidant person experiences something rare and deeply uncomfortable. Their defenses fail completely. They cannot manipulate the other person into chasing through withdrawal because the person has explicitly stated they won't chase. They cannot deny the pattern because it's been named directly. They cannot blame the other person for being too needy because the person is demonstrating the opposite of neediness by refusing to pursue. The avoidant person finds themselves in a position where they must either examine their patterns honestly or accept that the relationship will end. This forced choice is precisely what the avoidant person has spent their life avoiding. They've structured their relationships to prevent exactly this moment of reckoning. They've relied on partners who pursue, who accept blame, who remain confused about what's happening. A partner who sees clearly and refuses to chase eliminates all the avoidant person's usual exits and deflections. The only options remaining are genuine vulnerability, which terrifies them, or complete withdrawal, which means losing someone who has demonstrated unusual strength and clarity. Neither option is comfortable, which is why the avoidant person desperately hopes these words are never spoken. The statement is most powerful when delivered without emotion or accusation. If said with anger or hurt, the avoidant person can dismiss it as an emotional reaction rather than a clear observation. They can focus on the other person's feelings rather than the content of what's being said. But when delivered with calm, factual clarity as a simple observation and boundary, the statement cannot be deflected. The person is not asking the avoidant to change or defending their own needs. They're simply stating what they see and what they will not do. This calm clarity is far more threatening than emotional confrontation because it demonstrates the person has already moved beyond hoping the avoidant will be different. The avoidant person often responds to this statement by attempting to restore the familiar dynamic through various strategies. They might pursue temporarily, demonstrating interest and investment to prove the statement wrong and draw the person back into a chasing position. They might create drama or a crisis that demands attention and engagement. They might oscillate between expressing vulnerability and withdrawing, trying to create confusion that undermines the person's clarity. All of these responses are attempts to avoid the genuine reckoning the statement demands. The avoidant person is trying to restore their control and the other person's pursuit without actually changing anything fundamental about their patterns. If these attempts fail, if the person maintains their boundary and continues refusing to chase, the avoidant person faces their worst fear, being genuinely seen and having that seeing lead not to pursuit, but to withdrawal. The person has seen the avoidance patterns and chosen not to participate in them. This is different from angry rejection, which confirms the avoidant person's belief that vulnerability leads to hurt. This is calm recognition that the dynamic isn't healthy and a clear choice to step out of it. The avoidant person cannot rationalize this as the other person being too needy or too demanding. They must confront that their patterns themselves are what's ending the relationship. Years later, many avoidant people identify this statement as a turning point, though often not in the relationship it was spoken in. The statement plants a seed that grows slowly. The avoidant person cannot forget being seen so clearly and having their patterns named so directly. Even if they lose that particular relationship, the words echo in future relationships when they find themselves enacting the same patterns. Some eventually use those words as a catalyst for change, entering therapy, or beginning the work of understanding their attachment patterns. But in the moment the words are spoken, they represent the avoidant person's greatest fear realized, being truly seen and losing the other person, not despite being seen, but because of it. Your fear of intimacy is hurting you more than it's protecting you. This statement strikes at the heart of the avoidant person's entire defensive structure by reframing their patterns as self-harm rather than self-protection. The avoidant person experiences their withdrawal and distance-creating behaviors as necessary protection against the dangers of intimacy. They believe, often unconsciously, that keeping people at a distance keeps them safe from rejection, betrayal, loss, engulfment, or exposure of their fundamental unworthiness. This belief is so deeply embedded that it operates as an unquestioned truth. The idea that their protective patterns might actually be harming them rather than serving them threatens to collapse the entire structure they've built their relational life upon. The avoidant person has never seriously considered that their fear of intimacy is the problem rather than the solution. They frame intimacy itself as the threat, viewing other people's desire for closeness as dangerous pressure that must be resisted. Their defensive patterns are experienced as wise caution, healthy boundaries, or simply their nature, rather than as fear-driven avoidance that prevents the very connection they need. When someone explicitly names these patterns as fear of intimacy that's causing harm, it forces the avoidant person to see their defenses from an entirely different perspective. The statement is particularly powerful because it includes compassion along with confrontation. It doesn't say the avoidant person is bad or broken. It says they're scared and that their fear-driven patterns are hurting them. This framing is harder to defend against than accusation or blame would be. The avoidant person cannot respond with righteous indignation about their boundaries being disrespected or their nature not being accepted. The statement isn't attacking them. It's expressing concern for them. This concern, this suggestion that someone sees their pain beneath their defenses, creates profound discomfort. The avoidant person's immediate response is usually to deny the fear entirely. They claim they're not afraid of intimacy, but simply prefer independence and space. They frame their patterns as a conscious choice rather than a fear-driven compulsion. This denial is an automatic defense against vulnerability. The statement demands acknowledging fear, which means admitting to weakness, to being controlled by emotions they claim not to have, to needing something they've spent their life pretending not to need. The denial allows them to maintain their self-image as a rational, independent person rather than a scared one. But the statement plants a doubt that's difficult to eradicate. Once someone has explicitly named their patterns as fear of intimacy, the avoidant person cannot completely unsee it. They begin noticing moments when they withdraw and recognizing that fear is what's driving them. They observe themselves creating distance precisely when closeness is being offered. They catch themselves sabotaging relationships that are going well. These observations accumulate evidence that maybe the statement was accurate, that maybe their patterns are driven by a fear they haven't acknowledged. The second part of the statement, that the fear is hurting them more than protecting them, is even more challenging to their worldview. The avoidant person has operated under the assumption that their defenses serve them, that they're better off with walls up than walls down. This assumption is deeply held because it's been reinforced by experiences where vulnerability did lead to pain. The avoidant person's attachment history typically includes moments where expressing needs led to rejection or where emotional openness was met with dismissal or exploitation. These experiences taught them that distance equals safety. The statement challenges this entire learning by suggesting the cost of the defenses exceeds their benefit. The avoidant person cannot immediately accept this reframing because it requires acknowledging they've been hurting themselves for years while believing they were protecting themselves. This recognition is too painful to embrace quickly. It means they've wasted time, lost relationships, and chosen isolation unnecessarily. The ego resists this recognition fiercely. It's easier to maintain the belief that the defenses are necessary and appropriate than to confront that they've been a self-imposed prison rather than a protective fortress. The avoidant person will likely reject the statement initially, defending their patterns as healthy and necessary. But if the person saying these words demonstrates through their own behavior what connection without threat looks like, the statement becomes harder to dismiss. If they maintain boundaries while staying present, if they demonstrate that intimacy doesn't mean engulfment, if they show that vulnerability can be met with care rather than exploitation, they provide living evidence that the avoidant person's fears might not be as justified as they believe. This evidence doesn't immediately change the avoidant person's patterns, but it creates cognitive dissonance. They observe someone offering intimacy without the threats they've learned to expect, and this observation contradicts their foundational beliefs about what closeness entails. The avoidant person desperately hopes this statement is never made because once it's spoken, they can no longer maintain complete unconsciousness about their patterns. They've been explicitly told that their defenses are fear-based and harmful. Even if they reject the statement initially, it remains lodged in their awareness. Future instances of their withdrawal will be tinged with doubt about whether they're protecting themselves or hurting themselves. This doubt is uncomfortable and unwelcome. The avoidant person preferred the certainty that their patterns were necessary and appropriate to the uncertainty this statement introduces. If the avoidant person eventually allows themselves to seriously consider the statement's accuracy, it can become a catalyst for profound change. They might begin examining their fear honestly, tracing it back to its origins in attachment experiences. They might start recognizing the cost their defenses have exacted, the loneliness, the superficial relationships, the constant need to maintain control, the inability to be fully known by anyone. They might acknowledge that the protection their defenses provide is protection against both pain and joy, that their walls keep out hurt but also keep out love. This recognition is the beginning of genuine growth. But most avoidant people, especially when the statement is first spoken, respond primarily with defensiveness and rejection. They cannot accept what the words suggest because accepting it would require dismantling their entire psychological structure. They dismiss the statement as a misunderstanding of their character, as projection of someone else's neediness onto them, as a failure to respect their boundaries and nature. This dismissal allows them to maintain their patterns without examining them. They continue operating as they always have, though the words often haunt them later when their patterns produce predictable, painful outcomes again. I deserve better than what you're capable of giving right now. This statement is devastating to the avoidant person because it accomplishes something their defenses are designed to prevent. It shifts the framework from them evaluating whether the other person is worth their limited emotional investment to the other person evaluating whether they're worth continued investment. The avoidant person is accustomed to being the one who withholds, who determines how much connection happens, who controls the pace and depth of the relationship. They maintain power through this withholding, keeping partners working to earn more access and attention. When someone states they deserve better, the entire power dynamic inverts. The statement doesn't say the avoidant person is bad or wrong. It says what they're capable of giving right now isn't enough to meet legitimate needs. This framing is crucial because it removes the avoidant person's usual defense of claiming the other person wants too much or is too needy. The statement accepts that the avoidant person has limitations in their current capacity for intimacy and simply declares those limitations incompatible with the other person's needs. There's no blame, no anger, just a clear assessment that what's being offered doesn't match what's required for a healthy relationship. The avoidant person's immediate response is typically some combination of shock and offense. They're shocked because they've never encountered a partner who concluded they deserve better rather than working harder to earn the avoidant person's affection. They're offended because the statement implies they're insufficient, that they're being evaluated and found wanting. The avoidant person is accustomed to being the evaluator, the one whose standards others must meet. Having the dynamic reversed triggers defensive responses designed to restore their position of power. These defensive responses often include attempting to devalue the person making the statement. The avoidant person might claim the person is being unrealistic about relationships, that they want too much, that they'll never find anyone who meets their excessive standards. These attacks are attempts to make the person doubt their assessment and return to accepting what the avoidant person offers. If the person can be made to feel their standards are too high, they might lower them and continue accepting breadcrumbs. The avoidant person needs this doubt to be restored because they cannot tolerate the clear-eyed assessment that they're not enough. But if the person stands firm in their statement, maintaining that they do deserve better and that this isn't about unrealistic standards, but about legitimate needs not being met, the avoidant person experiences profound discomfort. They're confronted with someone who values themselves enough to walk away from an inadequate relationship rather than staying and hoping for change. This self-respect is both attractive and terrifying to the avoidant person. Attractive because security and self-possession are qualities the avoidant person wishes they had. Terrifying because it means this person genuinely will leave if the avoidant person cannot show up differently. The statement forces the avoidant person to confront that their limited emotional availability has consequences. They've typically moved through relationships believing they could offer minimal emotional investment while maintaining access to the benefits of connection. Their partner's pursuit and willingness to accept little suggested this arrangement worked indefinitely. The statement reveals it doesn't work, that people eventually recognize they're getting crumbs and choose to leave the table entirely. This recognition threatens the avoidant person's entire relational strategy. Some avoidant people respond to this statement by temporarily increasing their investment, demonstrating that they're capable of giving more in an effort to keep the person from leaving. This response is typically reactive rather than reflective. The avoidant person isn't increasing intimacy because they've developed greater capacity. They're increasing it because they're panicked about losing control. As soon as the threat of the person leaving is neutralized, as soon as the person seems reassured and reinvested, the avoidant person's behavior returns to previous patterns. The brief increase in availability was a manipulation to restore the status quo rather than genuine change. Other avoidant people respond by withdrawing completely, essentially leaving before they can be left. This response protects their ego from the injury of being evaluated as insufficient. By leaving first, they maintain their power and avoid the vulnerability of being rejected. They tell themselves and others that the person who said they deserve better was too demanding, wanted too much, wasn't compatible. These rationalizations protect the avoidant person from examining whether the statement was accurate, whether they really aren't capable of giving what a healthy relationship requires. The statement's power lies in its unassailability. The person isn't attacking the avoidant individual's character or demanding they change. They're simply asserting their own worth and declaring that what's being offered doesn't meet the standard they've set for themselves. The avoidant person has no legitimate argument against someone claiming they deserve to have their needs met in a relationship. They can only argue the needs are unreasonable, which is difficult when the needs are basic things like consistency, emotional presence, and genuine intimacy. The avoidant person finds themselves in a position where they must either acknowledge their limitations and do the work to expand their capacity, or accept that those limitations will prevent them from maintaining a relationship with this person. Years later, many avoidant people recognize this statement as the most loving thing a partner ever said to them. Not because it felt loving at the time, but because it demonstrated respect for both parties. The person respected themselves enough to refuse an inadequate relationship. They also respected the avoidant person enough to be honest about the incompatibility rather than staying and growing resentful. The honesty, though painful, can eventually become a catalyst for the avoidant person's growth if they're capable of receiving it. But in the moment, the statement represents exactly what the avoidant person hopes never to hear. A clear-eyed assessment that their defenses make them unable to provide what partnership requires. I'm not angry at you. I just don't want this anymore. This final statement might be the most frightening of all because it demonstrates complete emotional disengagement. The avoidant person can handle anger, hurt, or disappointment from partners. These emotions confirm they have impact, that they matter enough to generate strong feelings. The emotions also provide something for the avoidant person to respond to, whether through defensiveness, attempting to soothe, or withdrawing further. But a complete absence of anger paired with a clear decision to end the relationship removes all the familiar dynamics the avoidant person knows how to navigate. The person isn't trying to make them feel guilty. They aren't seeking an explanation or closure. They simply no longer want what the relationship provides. The statement's power comes from its neutrality. There's no emotional charge for the avoidant person to react to or deflect. The person has moved beyond the stage where the avoidant person's behavior triggers hurt or anger. They've reached acceptance that this is who the avoidant person is and a clear decision that they don't want to be in a relationship with someone who operates this way. This acceptance and clarity is far more final than anger would be. Anger suggests continued emotional investment that could potentially be transformed back into hope or connection. The calm statement of not wanting this anymore suggests the person has genuinely released attachment to the outcome. The avoidant person's typical defenses don't work against this statement. They cannot claim the person is being too emotional or overreacting because there's no emotion to point to. They cannot defend themselves against accusations because none are being made. They cannot blame the person's feelings for the relationship's problems because the person is simply stating they don't want to continue. The avoidant person finds themselves stripped of all their usual responses, facing someone who has stepped completely out of the dynamic that allowed their patterns to function. The lack of anger is particularly destabilizing because it suggests the person has processed their feelings and reached a resolution without needing anything from the avoidant person. Usually, the avoidant person's partners express hurt or anger that gives the avoidant person a role in their emotional process. The hurt partner needs validation or an apology or an explanation. The angry partner needs to express their feelings and have them acknowledged. These needs give the avoidant person a position in the other person's emotional landscape, maintaining their relevance even negatively. But someone who has processed their feelings independently and simply decided they're done has removed the avoidant person from their emotional process entirely. This removal is what the avoidant person fears most. Not anger or hurt, which confirm they matter, but genuine indifference that suggests they've become irrelevant.